Hi, and welcome to Readings from Gift of the Shaper. I'm your host, DL Jennings. Happy you're here. So this is going to be Chapter 11, and this takes place in the Athrani prison outside of Lusk. Getting Adrian up the stairs was treacherous in its own right, and every step that Olsen took was met with groans from the decrepit wood. When they reached the top, they kept on, straight down the hallway that led to the site of their earlier encounter. As they approached the corridor where they had fought only moments before, they stepped past the translucent cage where Dylas had trapped their two assailants, who still pounded at its walls pleadingly. Olsen eyed the body of Rimble, who still lay on the ground in the same position he'd left him after he finished smashing his fist into his well-scarred face. He wasn't moving, and that suited Olsen just fine. "Let's get out of here," he said. Dylas and Adrian had no objections. Just as they were about to leave the room, though, Olsen heard a noise come from Rimble's direction. He couldn't quite make it out. It sounded like a grunt of desperation more than anything, but it was followed by what sounded like a bone bouncing off the stone floor. He turned just in time to see the room flood with light. Shielding his eyes from the emerald glow filling the room, Olsen squinted in confusion as the walls began to tremble. He looked to Rimble, who was still lying on the floor, to make sure he wasn't seeing things. "What did you do?" Olsen shouted. "Like I'd tell you," Rimble grunted. He followed it up with a sound like strained laughter. Something on the edge of Olsen's vision caught his eyes as he looked back to the trembling walls, from which progressively bigger and bigger chunks of gray stone had begun dropping onto the floor. Enough of them had come loose that he was sure the walls were about to collapse around them. He watched as the stones on the floor came together in the same way that iron filings would attack a magnet. Then, when the pile of stone had grown large enough, it stood up. "Dylas," Olsen said as he backed up, "are you seeing this?" The Athrani half-eye was staring at the pile of stones that had taken a human-like form. It was huge and sturdy-looking, despite being cobbled together from the dregs of the prison walls. "I am," was all that Dylas said. The hulking figure lumbered toward Olsen, its feet sinking into the ground with each thunderous step that it took. Keeping his eyes on it, Olsen knelt to place Adrian on the ground as he shouted gruffly to Dylas, "I hope you got some really great rest back there." Dylas's eyes were white-hot. "We shall see," he said flatly. The stone creature continued toward Olsen, who was gathering himself for either impact or counterattack. Dylas raised his hands into the air, and the fog that had come before began to swirl and thicken around the creature. The whole room seemed steeped in clouds that thickened and turned to a solid gray. Olsen watched, impressed, as the creature stopped in its tracks, trapped inside the impenetrable prison that Dylas had conjured from the thin air. "Nicely done," Olsen said, dropping his guard. But as the creature's arm burst through the cage, Dylas could do nothing but watch as its other arm broke free, followed by a rocky torso and head. Both men stared with growing concern as the rest of the creature emerged and charged once more, straight at Olsen. "I take it back," Olsen said, ducking a wildly swung fist from the creature. He lowered his shoulder and charged into the midsection of the great stone golem, driving it back toward the wall. It took every ounce of strength he had to move the thing. "Where did this come from?" he shouted to Dylas as they slammed against the wall. "I hardly see how that is relevant right now," Dylas said. Taking a blow to the stomach that knocked him halfway across the room, Olsen inhaled sharply and looked up with narrowed eyes at his Athrani compatriot. "Because I'd like to figure out how to stop it." Adrian sat up and was looking at Rimble. "Him," he said with all the strength he could muster. "It came from him." Watching Rimble wheeze with laughter between strained breaths, Olsen asked, "Is he Athrani?" As the words left his mouth, the creature charged at him again. "No, but he somehow has the power of shaping," Adrian answered, confusion in his voice. "The other world does not flow through him, but it surrounds him." The creature clasped its hands together and brought them down on Olson, who caught the brunt of the blow on his shoulders and dropped to his knees. Defiantly, he stood back up and smashed his fist into the creature's face with just as much pain as futility. He shook his hand in agony as the creature head-butted his chest and sent him staggering backward. "I've used hammers softer than this thing," he yelled at Dialis, who looked to be wandering around the room in search of something. "Any help you can offer would be nice." Sidestepping a head-on charge from the creature, Olson watched as it crashed straight through the stone wall and into another room. "Just give me a moment," Dialis said as he deftly checked the pockets of the barely conscious big man. "Breaker's hammer, Dialis! You and your moments!" Olson bellowed, trying to get a glimpse of the creature through the dust it had kicked up. He saw it early enough to take a dangling piece of the wall and throw it at the creature's head. The stone smashed to bits and appeared to not even faze the creature, but certainly served to enrage it. "Ah, here it is," Dialis said. He held aloft the white horn that he'd found near Rimble. "Catch!" Dialis tossed the bony growth to Olson, who caught it and looked more confused than when the creature had first showed up. "And?" he asked as he raised his forearm to shield himself from the moving statue that bore down on him. "That horn somehow controls the creature," he answered simply. Faster than he could think, Olson took the pointed end of the horn and brought it down in a merciless blow to the top of the creature's head. He buried it halfway and kept going, following through with every bit of strength left in him. It was enough. In mid-stride, the creature dropped to the ground and broke apart, leaving nothing but clouds of dust and a pile of stone that matched the walls of the prison. After the air had finally cleared, Olson lowered the arm that shielded his face and looked at Dialis. "I think now is as good a time as any to make our way outside." Dialis nodded in agreement. "This way," he said to Olson, who gave Rimble a kick in the ribs before helping up Adrian. "Just let me catch my breath," Olson mumbled. His fists were throbbing, and he was hoping that the pain in his shoulder wasn't serious. "Otherwise, you're going to have to drag both of us out of here." A thin smile spread across Dialis' lips. "Of course." "What do we do with him?" Olson asked as he sat down, nodding to Rimble. The big man was drifting in and out of consciousness, but still represented a threat. "Especially if he has any more of those horns," Olson thought. Dialis paled at the question. "Are you asking—" He leaned into Olson and whispered, "Are you asking if we should kill him?" Olson laughed. "Relax, Dialis. I meant we should probably move him somewhere." The half-eye visibly relaxed. "Oh, thank goodness," he said. "That's much better than the alternative." He looked back at Olson. "But I don't think any of us are in any shape to do so." Olson looked at the big man on the floor and felt the pain surging through his shoulders and arms. Dialis is right, he thought. After the beating he'd just taken, he could barely help Adrian, who weighed maybe half as much. He watched Rimble's chest moving up and down as it looked like the big man had slipped into unconsciousness. "He's not going anywhere," Olson finally said. He knew that the longer they rested there, the less chance they had of escape. With a grimace, he stood up and said, "Leave him. Let's go." Dialis helped Adrian to his feet, and the three of them made their way out of the room and toward some promising rays of light that seemed to point to an exit. After a fair amount of walking, the three of them found themselves in an entryway of sorts, with a large set of double doors. Olson eyed them warily and turned to Dialis. "I don't know too much about the men who captured us," he started. "Could this be rigged with a trap of some sort, with shaping?" Dialis stepped forward and looked them over. The doors were huge and as ornate as they were massive. They had carvings from top to bottom depicting scenes from history and myth. A carving near the bottom showed a group of people raising their hands skyward, and one figure surrounded by a light with a hammer in one hand and a glowing chain in the other, poised to strike an anvil. Another picture portrayed a dark figure reaching out his hand and a cluster of smaller figures reaching out for it. On the very top of both was a giant white skeletal hand about the size of a man. "I don't think they're trapped," Dialis said. He reached out and traced one of the carvings on the door with his finger. "But what is this place?" "I don't know," Olson answered. Besides the carving on the doors, he didn't see anything else remarkable about where they were being held. From what he could tell, it was nothing more than a prison. "And I'd really rather not find out. Help me get these doors open. Adrian is starting to get heavy." Dylas shot an annoyed look back at Olson, but did as he was asked. Pushing on one of the heavy doors, it opened with a groan. The last of the light had retreated from the sky, leaving only darkness outside, with a tiny fingernail of a moon above. Before them stretched trees in all directions, and the walls of the prison were overgrown with ivy. It looked like it had been abandoned for quite some time, but had clearly been repurposed and revitalized for whatever these men were using it for. Olson looked back at the huge stone structure and scratched his head, wondering just how many Athrani had seen the insides of it, and how many had managed to make it back out. "This way," Dylas said, emerging from a trail that led into the woods. Olson turned and followed, with Adrian leaning on him heavily for support. When they were well clear of the prison, Olson stopped and helped Adrian to the ground, then stood up and stretched. "We need to get him home," Dylas said to him. "To Elenos." The younger Athrani's face was pale, and his now human eyes were focused on something in the distance. "Oh no," Olson said sternly. "He's your problem. I have to get back to my son." "Olson," Adrian said weakly. The words were soft, but enough to make both men stop and listen. "Whatever the Kith have done to me, it's clear that there is more at stake here than your own life, or even the life of your son. Know this, they will not stop with just one Athrani." He paused. "If the Kith have their way, a missing father will be the least of your son's concerns." "He's right," Dylas said. "Elenos must be warned. If the Kith have figured out a way to take our power, there may be no stopping them." Adrian coughed and took a breath. "The one who did this," he coughed again, "to Cain. He is after the hammer of the World Forge." Dylas stood up and stared into the emptiness of the night. "Then we have no choice." Olson turned from both of them and looked at the sky, taking in the faint light of the moon, and put one hand on his chin, stroking the length of his beard, and thought. "How far is Elenos?" "We would never make it in time by traveling on foot," Adrian admitted. "Whatever the Kith are planning," said Dylas, "must be dealt with swiftly and soon. We need horses, fast ones. Once we find some that suit our needs, we can make it in a few days' travel." Olson scratched his head and frowned. He looked at Dylas, then at Adrian. "One is almost too weak to walk, and the other can barely handle himself in a fight." He took a deep breath and resigned himself to help. "Fine, but we stop when I say, and you pay for my horse." He tossed Dylas a few coins. "This might help. I took it off one of the guards." The half-eye smiled at the sight of coins. "Agreed. Now let's get him on his feet so we can put as much ground as possible between this place and us." Olson and Dylas each took one of Adrian's hands and helped him up. "Thank you," Adrian said weakly. "We should head west to Anok," said Dylas. "We have our best chance of finding some good horses for sale there." Olson grunted as he looked up at the stars. "There are two things I'm good at, eating and hitting things. Navigation isn't on the list." "Follow me," Dylas said. "I can get us at least pointed in the right direction." The three men traveled westbound, deciding to keep the roads by night and stay clear of them during the day. Dylas made a case for staying hidden in the fact that not one but two of them were Athrani, and obviously so. Both he and Adrian had the look. They were tall, though next to Olson they may have appeared normal, and Dylas's eyes spilled the secrets of his birth to anyone who looked. "When the Athrani became enlightened," he had told Olson, "the power of the other world came flooding into them and filled them up like a reservoir, full to the point of bursting." Adrian was still struggling to walk, so they'd moved a little bit off the road and sat down. Dylas was examining him as best he could, using his shaping abilities to prod and probe where his eyes could not, with Olson watching in wonder. When Dylas shaped, there was a glow that emanated from his eyes, and when his hands would move close to Adrian, sparks of light would emanate from his fingertips like there was a current running through the two of them. He continued on like this for a few more minutes, then stood up to take Olson aside. "I don't know how they did it, but they've completely taken away his shaping ability," Dylas said quietly. "He's lost his link with the other world." "What's going to happen to him?" "I can't say. Just a day ago I would have said that this was impossible. A male Athrani with no shaping ability is simply unheard of." He turned his head to look again at Adrian. "Even for half-eyes like us. It's like taking the light out of the stars." Just then Adrian made a loud groan of pain, and Dylas hurried back over to him. He called to Olson over his shoulder. "See if you can find some water for him. There's a skin over there." Olson nodded and walked over to where Dylas indicated, finding an empty skin for water, then heading back toward the road. It was quiet on the path, and he listened for running water. When he heard none, in order to keep from getting lost, he rubbed his boots in the dirt to make the location of their stop. When he heard none, in order to keep from getting lost, he rubbed his boots in the dirt to mark the location of their stop and headed down the road. For a while, all he heard was the sound of leaves rustling as the breeze danced through them and the occasional bird calling out. Gotta cleanse the old palate. Finally, the faint sound of running water came from up ahead, and he quickened his pace. He came to a small stream, narrow enough for him to step easily across. He took out Dylas's water skin and knelt down to fill it. Just as he finished, he heard a faint but terrible scream. "Adrian," he thought. He tied the skin at the mouth and took off in a run, keeping his eyes open for the spot that he had marked. He wouldn't need it, though, as Adrian's agonized cries were enough of a beacon to guide him, even if it were pitch black outside. "What's the matter?" Olson asked as he handed the water skin to Dylas, who was seated on the ground, cross-legged, Adrian's head in his lap. Adrian was staring blankly at the trees above. "I don't know, but it isn't good. His body is hot all over, and he doesn't respond to my voice anymore. It's like he isn't here." Suddenly a thin red light shot out from Adrian's chest, and he made a choking sound as a hole tore itself open in his throat. Blood bubbled up to the surface and flowed out with every beat of his heart. Dylas's eyes opened wide, and he put his hands on the wound in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding, but it was too deep, like an arrow had been shot clear through his neck. "Can't you do something?" Olson asked as panic engulfed him. Dylas looked up at him from the Athrani bleeding to death in front of him. His eyes were already glowing with the power of the otherworld. "I am," he said flatly. A second wound opened itself and began to bleed from Adrian's chest. "His body is falling apart. I'm doing everything I can to hold it together." Olson stood in silence, feeling powerless for one of the few times in his life. "If an Athrani can't help," he thought, "it's all but hopeless." The Athrani ability to heal using the power that existed in the other world was unique in all the world, and was a source of much of their pride. Ever since the first Athrani had harnessed that power, their focus had been on preserving and improving life. But even that was slipping away from Dylas as he watched a life quickly being extinguished before him. Adrian continued to gasp and choke as blood pooled beneath him, darkening the grass and creeping its way slowly outward as it gathered. Olson felt the air around them getting warmer, as Dylas was suddenly enveloped in a glow that flickered like a white flame. "I don't understand," Dylas said in a panic. "Everything I pour into him just seems to seep right back out, like his body is rejecting it." He looked up at Olson, draped in power, but looking as helpless as a child. Adrian's gasping finally stopped as the last of his breath left him, and Dylas let his head slip from his hands. The glow around him subsided, and he slumped forward in defeat. Olson stood quietly, unsure of what to say. Dylas was the one to break the silence. What do you say now about our journey to Elenos? Without even taking time to consider, Olson said, I say we find the fastest horses we can buy. Dylas nodded. We will rest tonight and make for Anarch at first light. But for now, he said as he turned away, I have a brother to bury. Olson frowned as the Athrani walked away. Turning back to the forest that would be their room for the night, he looked for a comfortable spot on the ground to lay his head. When he found one, sleep came quickly. So I know I said I was going to listen to your feedback last week on Chapter 10, but the observant ones among you will notice that I'm wearing the exact same shirt, and my hair is exactly in the same style as Chapter 10. So I can explain. And basically, I'm doing this right after I recorded Chapter 10, so I kind of wanted to dive right into it. And, well, here's the result. So, sorry I didn't listen to you. I'm a liar. Gotta cleanse the old palate.